Imagine a city in ruins. Its walls, once a source of protection against enemy attacks, now lie completely destroyed. The gates, symbols of security and control over who entered or left, have been burned to ashes. The inhabitants, once a prosperous and revered people, now live in humiliation, exposed and hopeless. This was the reality of Jerusalem during the time of Nehemiah. The people of Israel had endured a long period of suffering. Approximately 70 years earlier, during Babylonian rule, the Temple of Jerusalem had been destroyed, and most of the city's inhabitants were exiled. When the Persian Empire conquered Babylon, King Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to their land and rebuild the temple. This initial return, recorded in the Book of Ezra, marked the beginning of an attempt at restoration. However, even with the temple rebuilt, Jerusalem remained vulnerable because its walls had never been restored. In the ancient world, city walls were more than just physical barriers against attack. They symbolized strength, stability, and the dignity of a people. Without them, Jerusalem was exposed both physically and emotionally. Enemies could invade at will, and the Jewish people, already weakened by exile, lacked a strong sense of national identity. It is in this context that we meet Nehemiah, a man living in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire. Nehemiah was neither a priest nor a prophet, but an ordinary man with significant responsibilities in the Persian court. He served as the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, a position of immense trust, as it involved tasting the king's wine to ensure it was not poisoned. This role not only brought Nehemiah into close contact with the monarch, but also made him an influential figure. Despite his comfortable and prestigious life in the king's court, Nehemiah did not ignore the plight of his people. He knew that Jerusalem was still in ruins and that the Jews who had returned lived under dire conditions. In the opening chapter of the book bearing his name, Nehemiah recounts a visit from Hanani, one of his brothers who came from Judah. Eager to know the state of his fellow Jews, Nehemiah asked, "How are the remnant that survived the exile, and how is Jerusalem?" Nehemiah 1:2. The response was devastating. In Nehemiah 1:3, Hanani reported, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." These words broke Nehemiah's heart. He immediately understood that without walls, Jerusalem would remain vulnerable, and the people would continue to be demoralized. The situation Nehemiah learned of was not merely a physical problem, but a spiritual one as well. Jerusalem was a symbol of God's presence among his people. Seeing the city in ruins reflected the people's estrangement from their covenant with God. For Nehemiah, the walls were not just stones. Rebuilding them meant restoring the dignity of the people and honoring God's name. Like many of us, Nehemiah faced a situation where he felt something needed to be done. He was not inherently powerful, but he bore a deep sense of responsibility for his people. This connection between Nehemiah and Jerusalem illustrates that God can use anyone to fulfill his purposes, even those seemingly distant from the problem at hand. Have you ever felt called to something greater, even in the face of immense challenges? Nehemiah faced this same sense of calling. He knew he needed to address the situation in Jerusalem, but before taking action, Nehemiah turned to the one who has the power to change all circumstances, God. Nehemiah did not merely hear Hanani's words about Jerusalem's condition, he deeply felt them. He did not respond with indifference. In Nehemiah 1:4, he describes his reaction. "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned, fasted, and prayed before the God of heaven." His response was not just emotional, but profoundly spiritual. Nehemiah did not attempt to act on his own. He brought his pain and concern directly to the God of Israel. Nehemiah's prayer, recorded in Nehemiah 1:5-11, is one of the most remarkable moments in the text. He begins by exalting the greatness of God, acknowledging his sovereignty and faithfulness to his covenant with Israel. In verse 5, Nehemiah proclaims, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. By starting this way, Nehemiah not only glorifies God, but also reaffirms his trust in God's character. He recognizes that the same God who made promises to Israel is capable of fulfilling them. Nehemiah then moves into confession, demonstrating his acknowledgement of the sins of his people. In verse 6 he pleads, "Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you." Nehemiah does not exclude himself from the collective guilt. He identifies with his people, acknowledging their failures to obey God's commands while expressing his desire for transformation. The prayer continues as Nehemiah recalls God's promises through Moses. In verse 8 he says, "Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name.'" This reference to Deuteronomy 31:5 reveals Nehemiah's deep knowledge of God's word and his belief in God's unwavering faithfulness, even in the face of human failure. Nehemiah does not appeal to his own abilities or merit, but to God's promise of restoration. After confessing and recalling God's promises, Nehemiah presents his request to the Lord. In verse 11 he pleads, "Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." Nehemiah understands that to act, he will need King Artaxerxes' permission, and he trusts that God can move the king's heart to open the necessary doors. Nehemiah does not see prayer as a last resort, but as the starting point of his mission. He fasts and prays continually, placing his dependence on God before taking any practical action. This time of spiritual seeking is crucial because Nehemiah knows the magnitude of the challenge ahead requires more than human planning. It demands divine intervention. God hears Nehemiah's prayer. In chapter 2, verse 1, it is noted that Nehemiah was serving wine to the king, and the king noticed something unusual. Nehemiah was sad. In Persian culture, showing sadness in the king's presence was risky, as it could be interpreted as disrespect. Nehemiah himself admits in verse 2, "I was very much afraid," yet he does not let fear paralyze him. God had prepared both Nehemiah's heart and the king's for this moment. In verse 4, King Artaxerxes asks, "What is it you want?" Before responding, Nehemiah offers a quick prayer to God. This act reflects his constant dependence on the Lord, even under pressure. He then presents his request, permission to go to Jerusalem to rebuild its walls. God's favor is evident in the king's response. In Nehemiah 2:6-8, Artaxerxes not only grants permission for Nehemiah to travel, but also provides letters of authorization for safe passage through various territories and supplies of timber from royal forests. This demonstrates how God was orchestrating every detail, paving the way for Nehemiah to fulfill his calling. Nehemiah's courage in depending on God is a powerful example of faith. He knew that making such a bold request to the king was dangerous, but he trusted that God was in control. Nehemiah did not attempt to resolve Jerusalem's problem with his own resources or influence. He placed everything in God's hands, and the Lord responded extraordinarily. This moment marks the beginning of Nehemiah's journey as a leader in a seemingly impossible mission. He was about to leave the safety of the Persian court to face unknown challenges in a devastated land. However, Nehemiah knew he was not alone. The same God who had heard his prayer would continue to guide him every step of the way. After receiving King Artaxerxes' approval, Nehemiah embarked on his approximately 1,500-kilometer journey from Persia to Jerusalem. In Nehemiah 2:9, he records that he traveled with army officers and cavalry provided by the king. This military escort ensured his protection, as the route was dangerous, filled with bandits and potential enemies. Additionally, Nehemiah carried letters signed by the king guaranteeing safe passage through the territories and authorization to acquire timber from royal forests, as detailed in Nehemiah 2:7-8. The journey was not only long and exhausting, but also daunting, as Nehemiah knew he was heading to a city in ruins, surrounded by adversaries who opposed its restoration. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, Nehemiah did not immediately announce his plans. He remained silent about his mission for 3 days. In chapter 2, verse 11, he states, "I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others." This initial pause likely allowed him to rest, but also to observe and understand the environment before taking action. That night, Nehemiah began a secret inspection of Jerusalem's walls. He wanted to see the extent of the damage firsthand before sharing his vision with the city's leaders. Nehemiah 2:12-15 describes how he went out with only a few men, without informing anyone of his plans, and surveyed the city's perimeter. He carefully examined the broken walls and burned gates, moving cautiously to avoid attracting attention. In Nehemiah 2:13, he narrates, "By night I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire." This nighttime inspection demonstrates Nehemiah's strategic wisdom. He knew that before mobilizing the people, he needed a clear understanding of the work ahead and the resources required. Additionally, acting in secret allowed him to avoid criticism or interference from opponents before he was ready to present his plan. After completing his inspection, Nehemiah summoned Jerusalem's leaders, including priests, nobles, and officials. In Nehemiah 2:17, he shared his vision. "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." By speaking this way, Nehemiah included himself in the people's plight, showing that he was not an outsider giving orders, but someone equally committed to their cause. Nehemiah not only inspired the people with words, but also shared how God had been faithful up to that point. In Nehemiah 2:18, he testified, "I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me." By doing so, Nehemiah demonstrated that his mission was not merely a human plan, but one guided by God from the start. This bolstered the leaders and people's confidence, who responded enthusiastically, "Let us start rebuilding," Nehemiah 2:18. Thus, they united in the work ahead. With the people's support, Nehemiah organized a detailed plan. He divided the reconstruction of the wall into sections and assigned specific parts of the work to different families and groups. Nehemiah 3 is entirely dedicated to describing how the wall was rebuilt, with each verse mentioning a group responsible for a portion of the project. For instance, in chapter 3, verse 1, we see that the priests began the work at the sheep gate. In verse 3, the sons of Hassenaah worked on the fish gate, while verse 8 highlights the involvement of craftsmen and merchants. Nehemiah's strategy was clever. He engaged all classes of society in the work, from religious leaders to ordinary residents. Each group focused on a specific section of the wall, often near their own homes, which instilled a sense of urgency and responsibility. This approach not only sped up the process, but also strengthened the unity among the people who shared a common goal. Nehemiah did not underestimate the importance of planning. He knew that rebuilding Jerusalem's walls would not be a simple task, especially with enemies closely watching. His plan, however, demonstrated that clear and focused leadership, combined with the cooperation of the people and God's guidance, could overcome any obstacle. Nehemiah acted not only as a strategist, but also as a leader who inspired confidence. The work had begun, but Nehemiah knew the challenges wouldn't end there. As the walls started to rise, external threats and internal difficulties also began to surface. Nehemiah's vision and reliance on God would remain essential for navigating the next steps of this journey. Soon after the reconstruction of the walls began, opposition arose. The restoration of Jerusalem deeply disturbed the neighboring peoples, especially those who had taken advantage of the city's weakness. Chief among the opponents were Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. Sanballat was the governor of Samaria, Tobiah was an Ammonite official, and Geshem was an Arab leader. These men joined forces against the project, mocking and attempting to demoralize the workers. In Nehemiah 2:19, it is recorded that Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem laughed at and despised Nehemiah, asking, "What is this you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" This accusation of rebellion was serious, as it could provoke the Persian king to act against Nehemiah and the people. But Nehemiah did not let himself be intimidated. He responded with confidence in God, as seen in verse 20. "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." Nehemiah's response reflects his faith and determination. He understood that the work was not merely human, it was a divine calling. Nehemiah avoided prolonged debates or discussions with his opponents. Instead, he remained focused on the task, trusting that God would be with the people. As the criticism persisted, the people stayed united in their reconstruction efforts. Nehemiah 3 describes how each group took responsibility for a section of the wall, working with speed and efficiency. This organization and dedication allowed the work to progress despite the challenges. The pace was intense, but the people's motivation was fueled by Nehemiah's clear vision and the conviction that they were undertaking a work for God. The mockery from Sanballat and his allies did not stop. In Nehemiah 4:1-3, Sanballat openly ridiculed the efforts, saying, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." These words were designed to discourage and ridicule the workers, planting doubt in their hearts. Tobiah, equally sarcastic, emphasized that the people's efforts were futile. In response to these provocations, Nehemiah once again turned to prayer. In chapter 4, verse 4, he cried out, "Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity." Nehemiah did not seek revenge through his own actions. He trusted God to bring justice. This allowed him and the people to stay focused on the work instead of being derailed by the criticism. As the walls began to take shape, the opponents realized that their mockery was having no effect. The people's response was a demonstration of unity and perseverance. Nehemiah 4:6 reports, "So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart." This statement is a testament to the strength that comes from a shared vision. Each worker, as they placed stones in the wall, knew they were contributing to something greater than themselves. The unity of the people was crucial for overcoming the difficulties. Nehemiah, as a leader, understood the importance of maintaining morale. He consistently reminded the people that they were doing God's work, emphasizing that success depended on divine protection and blessing. This approach not only kept the focus, but also strengthened mutual trust among the workers. The perseverance of the people in the face of external criticism is a powerful lesson. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem represented not only physical opposition, but also the voices of doubt that often try to hinder progress. Nehemiah and the people demonstrated that the best response to criticism is to continue the work with determination and faith. They refused to let words of discouragement become obstacles. Instead, they used those words as motivation to move forward. Even when the opponents intensified their actions, the people did not divide or lose focus. Nehemiah led wisely, encouraging collaboration and ensuring that every worker felt their contribution was essential. This unity was what enabled the work to continue even under pressure. The walls of Jerusalem were slowly being restored, stone by stone, as the people stood firm in their mission. Despite external challenges, their collective vision and faith in God kept them united and motivated. However, the challenges were far from over, and Nehemiah knew that new threats would arise as the work continued. As the reconstruction of the walls progressed, new challenges emerged, this time from within the Jerusalem community itself. The external problems, such as the mockery and threats from enemies, had been overcome through unity and determination. Yet internal conflicts began to surface, threatening the cohesion of the people. In Nehemiah 5:1, it is reported that a great outcry arose among the Jews. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. The problems began because many poor Jews were being exploited by their wealthier counterparts. During the reconstruction, many had to abandon their fields to dedicate themselves to the work on the wall, which led to economic hardships. Moreover, a famine worsened the situation, forcing families to take out loans to buy food or pay taxes to the king. In Nehemiah 5:3, some said, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." Others, in verse 4, stated, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards." The wealthy were taking advantage of this situation to exploit the poor. Many were charging exorbitant interest, and when families couldn't repay their debts, they were forced to sell their children into slavery. This practice was not only unjust, but also violated God's law, which forbade usury and commanded the Israelites to care for one another in times of need, as recorded in Exodus 22:25-27 and Leviticus 25:35-37. Nehemiah was deeply angered upon hearing these complaints. In chapter 5, verse 6, he expressed his reaction. "When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry." But Nehemiah did not act impulsively. In verse 7, he explained that he first reflected on the situation before taking action. "I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials." This careful approach demonstrates that Nehemiah acted not rashly, but with wisdom and justice. Nehemiah directly confronted the leaders and the wealthy who were exploiting the vulnerable. He called a large assembly to address the problem publicly. In verse 7, he declared, "You are charging your own people interest." Nehemiah exposed the injustice and appealed to the conscience of those involved. He reminded them that many Jews had been redeemed from slavery during the exile, and it was inconceivable that they were now being enslaved by their own brothers. In verse 9, Nehemiah emphasized the spiritual and moral implications of their actions. "What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies?" He highlighted that the injustice was not merely a social issue, but a spiritual one that dishonored God and weakened the people's testimony before neighboring nations. The response of the people was immediate. The nobles and leaders acknowledged their wrongdoing and promised to restore everything they had taken. Nehemiah 5:12 records their words. "We will give it back and will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say." Nehemiah did not simply take them at their word, but ensured the promise was upheld. He called the priests to formalize the agreement and had the leaders swear an oath to return the property and cancel the debts. This public act strengthened trust among the people and ensured justice was restored. Nehemiah's integrity was crucial at this moment. He led not just with words, but by example. In chapter 5, verse 14, Nehemiah revealed that during the 12 years he served as governor of Judah, he refused the benefits of the position. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. While previous governors had exploited the people, Nehemiah chose to serve with humility and dedication. He refused to levy taxes or accumulate wealth at the expense of others. Instead, he worked alongside the people on the reconstruction and even used his own resources to support his team and provide food for others. Nehemiah not only addressed immediate problems, but also implemented structural changes to protect the vulnerable. He established standards of justice and equality that reflected God's law, ensuring that the wealthy would not exploit the poor in the future. His leadership brought stability and restored trust within the community. This episode demonstrates that Nehemiah was not merely a strategist or a wall builder, but a leader deeply committed to social justice. He understood that rebuilding Jerusalem was not only a physical task, but also a moral and spiritual one. Nehemiah showed that true leadership is not about personal gain, but about working for the good of all, especially the most vulnerable. The story of Nehemiah teaches us the importance of leading with integrity and compassion. He did not shy away from confronting injustice, but acted courageously and wisely to correct what was wrong. Nehemiah demonstrated that the unity of the people and obedience to God are essential to overcoming challenges and building a strong and just community. As the walls of Jerusalem neared completion, external enemies intensified their efforts to halt the work. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem realized that criticism and mockery had not discouraged the people and began plotting more aggressive strategies, including the threat of physical violence. In Nehemiah 4:7, it is recorded, "But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry." This anger led to a conspiracy to attack Jerusalem and stop the progress. Nehemiah did not underestimate the seriousness of the threats. He knew the enemies were determined to frustrate the reconstruction, but he did not allow fear to paralyze the people. In Nehemiah 4:9, he recounts the first step he took, "But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat." This combination of prayer and action is one of Nehemiah's hallmarks of leadership. He trusted in divine protection, but also took practical precautions to ensure the workers' safety. As the pressure mounted, Nehemiah noticed that the people were starting to lose heart. The work was exhausting, and the constant threat of attack weighed heavily on the workers. In Nehemiah 4:10, the people voiced their struggles. "The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." Moreover, in verse 11, the enemies openly declared, "Before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to the work." Nehemiah responded to these threats with wisdom and courage. He reorganized the workers, dividing them into those who would continue rebuilding and those who would be designated for armed protection. In Nehemiah 4:13, he explains, "Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows." He also encouraged the people, reminding them that they were fighting not only for themselves, but also for their families and their faith. In verse 14, Nehemiah says, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes." Nehemiah's strategy was clear. Maintain focus on the work while implementing defensive measures. Each worker had a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other. Nehemiah 4:17-18 describes, "Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other, and each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked." Nehemiah also assigned trumpeters to sound the alarm in case of an enemy attack, ensuring that the people could respond quickly. Despite all these challenges, the work continued. The enemies realized their plans were failing because Nehemiah and the people were always vigilant and well organized. In chapter 6, the opposition tried a new tactic, sending messages to Nehemiah, inviting him to meet them outside the city. This was a trap, as Nehemiah reveals in verse 2, "They were scheming to harm me." Nehemiah responded with firmness and determination. In chapter 6, verse 3, he sent this reply, "I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you?" Nehemiah knew his presence was crucial to leading the people, and yielding to these distractions could jeopardize all progress. He did not allow intimidation attempts to divert him from his purpose. The enemies did not give up easily. They sent the same message to Nehemiah 4 times, and when that failed, they tried spreading rumors that Nehemiah was planning to rebel against the king of Persia. But Nehemiah remained steadfast, praying to God for strength and discernment. In chapter 6, verse 9, he cries out, "Now strengthen my hands." This trust in God was essential for Nehemiah to continue leading the people with courage. Active defense and reliance on God were fundamental to the success of the reconstruction. Nehemiah never lost sight of the importance of seeking God in prayer, even as he took practical steps to protect the work. He understood that the mission was not just about building physical walls, but also about restoring the people's faith and identity. His leadership exemplified a balance between spirituality and action, showing that both are vital in times of crisis. With each challenge overcome, the wall of Jerusalem took shape. The enemies were frustrated, and the people grew more determined. Nehemiah knew the completion of the work was near, but also that the true restoration of Jerusalem involved more than stones and gates. The spiritual and communal work remained as essential as the construction. After facing external opposition, internal conflicts, and logistical challenges, the Wall of Jerusalem was finally completed. Nehemiah 6:15 records the achievement with simplicity yet depth. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. This was an impressive milestone, not only because of the speed of the work, but also because of its profound significance. It was proof that, with faith in God, cooperation, and determined leadership, what seemed impossible could be achieved. The wall's completion had a profound impact not only on Jerusalem, but also on the surrounding enemies. Nehemiah 6:16 describes, "When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God." This accomplishment was not just a material victory, it revealed God's hand working on behalf of his people. With the walls finished, Nehemiah and Ezra, the scribe and priest, led the people in a spiritual celebration. They understood that Jerusalem's true restoration depended not only on physical walls, but also on spiritual revival. Nehemiah 8 recounts this pivotal moment. On the first day of the 7th month, all the people gathered in the square before the water gate. They asked Ezra to bring out the book of the law of Moses and read it aloud. In Nehemiah 8:3 it says, "He read it aloud from daybreak till noon, as he faced the square before the water gate, in the presence of the men, women, and others who could understand. And all the people listened attentively to the book of the law." This was a moment of great reverence, as many had never heard God's law before. The reading was accompanied by explanations from the Levites to ensure everyone clearly understood the meaning of the text. The people's reaction was one of deep remorse. Nehemiah 8:9 recounts that, upon hearing the law, the people began to weep, recognizing their sins and their separation from God. However, Nehemiah, Ezra, and the Levites encouraged them to celebrate rather than mourn. Nehemiah 8:10 records, "This day is holy to our Lord. Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." Thus, the people celebrated with a great feast, sharing food and expressing gratitude to God. This moment of spiritual renewal did not end there. In chapter 9, the people gathered again, this time for a day of fasting, confession of sins, and worship. Nehemiah 9:3 describes, "They stood where they were and read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for a quarter of the day, and spent another quarter in confession and in worshipping the Lord their God." This collective confession was followed by a long and heartfelt prayer, acknowledging God's faithfulness throughout history and the people's sins. After this spiritual renewal, the people of Israel made a covenant with God. Nehemiah 10 records the commitments they undertook, such as obeying the law, keeping the Sabbath holy, and supporting the temple. These decisions demonstrated that the spiritual revival had borne tangible fruits, prompting the people to reorganize their lives according to God's will. Nehemiah also continued working to strengthen the stability of the community. He implemented social and religious reforms to ensure the people remained faithful to the covenant. Nehemiah 13 details some of these reforms, such as purifying the temple, reorganizing the system of offerings, and reintroducing the Sabbath as a sacred day of rest. Nehemiah faced resistance to some of these changes, but stood firm, always prioritizing God's will over human opinions. The story of Nehemiah is a timeless example of leadership, faith, and courage. He demonstrated that a true leader not only guides people during crises, but also works to secure a sustainable future founded on justice. Nehemiah was not deterred by challenges, whether external or internal. He remained steadfast in his trust in God and in his determination to do what was right. This narrative also challenges us to reflect on our own lives. Nehemiah teaches us that rebuilding walls, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, is possible when we place our faith in God and stay committed to our purpose. Like Nehemiah, we may face criticism, hardships, and distractions, but with courage and focus, we can achieve what seems impossible. And what about you? What wall in your life needs rebuilding? Perhaps it's a broken relationship, a forgotten dream, or even your connection with God. Nehemiah shows us that with faith, planning, and action, no challenge is too great. May we be inspired by this story and seek in God the strength needed to rebuild the walls that uphold our lives and our faith.